I decided I was so bored with my reading pieces. I'm very jet-lagged. That I would read a new piece. I've never read this piece before. So it could turn out to be unpleasant. It's not too long, don't worry. I should give you a bit of a staging for this. Our heroine, Juliet Armstrong, is 18 and she's been recruited by MI5 to work in a clerical position as a typist, which is very tedious, but she's working for a man called Peregrine Gibbons, who will become her handler when she actually gets to do real spying. But at the moment, they don't know each other very well, but she has a bit of what I think at that time would have been called a bit of a pash on him. She finds him incredibly handsome. This will be a relationship that goes absolutely nowhere because he doesn't really like women. Let's put it like that. So she's sitting at her typewriter at the end of the day. Behind her, Peregrine Gibbons cleared his throat as if about to make an announcement, but really he was just trying not to startle her with his entry into the room. He had a way of moving very quietly, prowling almost. Juliet supposed he had learnt that from his nature studies. She imagined him creeping up on some poor, unsuspecting hedgehog and giving it the fright of its life. Sorry to interrupt, Miss Armstrong. That's all right, sir. Did you want something? Today's Friday, Miss Armstrong. All day, sir. And tomorrow is Saturday. It is, she agreed. Was he going to name all the days of the week, she wondered. I was thinking, sir, would you like to come on a little expedition with me? The word made her think of Scott and Shackleton, but it seemed unlikely that he was planning on taking her to the South Pole. They drove instead to the Hambledon Valley, where they swapped the comforting warmth of the car for a chilly riverbank. Countryside was more of a concept for Juliet than a reality. She'd been expecting to be viewing landscape from the windows of the car, not to find herself standing in the middle of it. Otters, he whispered, spreading a tarpaulin sheet on the riverbank. Sir? Had he said otters? So this was not to be a seduction, then. Juliet wondered if waiting for the otters was perhaps part of her training in some way, surveillance perhaps. And it did feel strangely like an undercover mission as they sat breathlessly still on the riverbank, waiting for a little family of otters to show themselves. He glanced at her when the first otter appeared and flashed her a delighted smile. The otters, she realized, were an offering to her in some way. If he was going to give her anything, she would rather it was the picnic that she'd expected him to bring. She had to hide her disappointment when she caught a glance of the empty boot of the car. Perhaps they would have a pub lunch later. She imagined herself a half of shandy and a beef and ale pie, and the idea lifted her spirits. Juliet likes to eat, I should add at this point. The otters, however, so slow to make an appearance, now seemed intent on putting an all-day show, and Juliet was relieved when her fit of coughing startled them and they slipped under the water and disappeared. Perry frowned, but she wasn't sure if he was disappointed in her or the otters. It must be lunchtime by now, surely. But no, instead they returned to the car and Perry said to the driver, "Drive in the direction of Christmas Common." And rather than stopping at the wayside inn of her imagination, they parked on a track next to a field. Her heart sank when he said to the driver, "We're going for a ramble. We'll be a while." He had binoculars with him, and she wondered if he was looking for anything in particular. "Kites," he said. Kites? Did he mean birds? Her mind ran on to Kit Kats, a thought that made her immeasurably sad as she knew that there were going to be none. He cupped his ear and said, "Can you hear that woodpecker?" Juliet knew nothing about birds. She could manage the common ones, pigeons, sparrows, and so on, but her ornithology didn't extend beyond the streets of London. She was a complete Philistine where wildlife was concerned. Perry, on the other hand, was a nature enthusiast. He didn't find kites, but he spotted and named an awful lot of other birds. An awful lot. "You need a good memory in our line of work," he said. But she wasn't going to be identifying birds, was she? Was she? "Look," he whispered, crouching and pulling her down with him. "Hares boxing. It's the female who throws the punches. Wonderful." Any romantic notions she may have been fostering had been entirely numbed by cold and hunger by now. He was currently expounding on the regurgitating habits of owls. "Fur and bone of voles and mice," he said, And she thought of the witches in Macbeth, and she laughed and responded with, "Eye of newt and toe of frog." "Well, yes," he said, perplexed by the illusion. "Frogs and rats are occasionally found in their pellets. Shrews are common." He had no Shakespeare, she realized. He strode ahead of her, and she had to go almost at a trot to keep up with him, trailing on his heels like a dutiful retriever. A nippy breeze had got up now and started to carry away his words, and she missed a lot of information about the breeding habits of roe deer and the architecture of rabbit warrens. The brooding landscape they were currently traversing, the lowering sky above their heads, and the rugged terrain beneath their feet were all conspiring to make her feel like an unfortunate Bronte sister, traipsing endlessly across the moors after unobtainable fulfillment. Thankfully, he came to a halt and said, "Shall we have a rest?" He laid the tarpaulin sheet down again in the inadequate shelter of a bare hawthorn hedge. Juliet shivered. It really wasn't the weather for this kind of thing. "Do you smoke?" he asked, taking out a heavy lighter from somewhere in his tweeds. "Yes, sir." "I don't, I'm afraid," he said. And so she had to fumble in her handbag for her own pack. No handy flask of tea, of course, and she was just bemoaning its absence to herself when he knelt down next to her and placed his hand on her thigh and began, rather absent-mindedly, to stroke the fabric of her coat, as if it were an animal skin, and she was the animal. Oh, my giddy aunt, Juliet thought. Was this finally what she thought it was? Was there protocol for this? Was it yet another test? She felt that some kind of protest was possibly required and said, "Sir, Mr. Gibbons?" "Call me Perry, do, please." For a moment, she thought he was going to open her coat, to unwrap her like a gift. "I am a gift," she thought. But he contented himself with fiddling with one of the buttons. He took his fedora off and placed it on the ground next to them. He took a cigarette from her and stubbed it out on the ground, and Juliet thought, "Oh, here we go." "I studied to be a priest, you know," he said. The balance tilted away from seduction. There certainly was a kind of Jesuitical cast to him. She could imagine him somber in a black cassock. "Unfortunately, I lost my faith," he said. Were they going to discuss theology? He leaned in closer, as if to inspect her, and she caught his tweedy tobacco scent. The balance tipped towards seduction again. He frowned at her. The balance wavered uncertainly. "Are you intact, Miss Armstrong?" "Intact, sir?" She had to think for a moment what he meant by that. "Oh," she said eventually. The balance lurched towards seduction. "Yes, sir." "It wasn't a question you asked if you weren't intending to do something about it, was it?" Although in her imagination, this act had involved dim lighting, satin sheets, perhaps flutes of champagne, and a discreet veil drawn over the crude mechanics of the act, mainly because she still had little idea of what they were. Also, on a practical level, she'd imagined a bed. Not a hillocky field beneath the thundery sky that was the colour of putty. An uncomfortable tussock was sticking into her left buttock. She could see dark clouds moving in from the west and thought, "We're going to get rained on." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw his hat blow away. "Oh," Juliet said again. He leaned closer, very close. He did not look attractive from this distance. In fact, he looked not a little unlike an otter himself. She closed her eyes. Nothing happened, so she opened them again and found him gazing steadily at her. And then he was on his feet, pointing at the sky and was saying, "Look, a sparrowhawk." Was that it then? She struggled to her feet and craned her neck obediently. The first fat, wet drops of rain fell on her face. "It's raining, sir," she said to him. He was heedless, lost in tracing the bird with his binoculars. And after a while, he handed them to her, and she put them to her eyes, but could see nothing but the dismal sky. "Did you see it?" he asked, when she lowered her binoculars. "Yes," she said. "Wonderful." They spent the next 20 minutes looking for his hat before giving up and returning to the car. The driver got out of the car when he saw them approaching. Juliet could see him smirking at Perry's hatless head and the rather mucky knees of his trousers where the tarpaulin had failed to protect him. "Good walk, sir?" the driver asked. "Excellent," Perry said. "We saw otters."